We are. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Briar Harvey. This is the Voices of Neurodiversity here on the Neurodiversity Media Network. And today I am joined by the delightful Megan Griffith, who you can find at neurodivergent_magic on Instagram. How are you today, Megan?
Oh, I'm so good. I'm excited to be here. How are you?
I am fantastic. So, we are fighting with people on the internet today,
A little.
and we are going to be talking about what you're fighting about. Mine is just stupid, but yours is truly incredible. So, Megan is an executive dysfunction coach. You would think that we would not have a lot in common, but in fact, we are both here together to talk about how laziness is not a thing. Not a
No.
thing, y'all. And I want to start a little bit with you and how you got here and why this is such a thorn in your side.
Okay. Well, personally, let's see. So like diagnosis journey or my laziness journey or both combined?
Both combined. We've got time.
Okay. Okay. So I grew up in your pretty typical Midwestern household where practicality is really prized, right? And we're very hard workers. We're very, work ethic is very important, and it's very much a bootstrap kind of mentality. Um, and so laziness is kind of seen as not the ultimate evil, but definitely up there, uh and definitely not something you want to be. And so whenever people were not meeting expectations, lazy was kind of the way you could motivate them, because it was this big bad scary word that was like it sort of represents being outcast from the tribe, because the tribe is so focused on productivity and practicality, and
Right.
laziness is the antithesis of that. So yeah, I grew up, it was never meant to be like this big bad mean thing. It was just part of the culture to despise laziness and to use it as a motivator. So that's how I grew up with laziness, which was a little hard for me because I didn't realize this until I was like 27, but I am autistic and ADHD. So there were definitely things I did, or rather, usually didn't do, as a kid or as a teen, that were very much perceived as lazy. Like, well into high school, I would forget to put my name on my paper, like constantly, not every now and again, all the time. And that was just seen as so lazy, or my handwriting sucks. It always has. And that was seen as lazy. Like, just take the time to be neat. And I'm like, but what? So anyway, it was just lots of little things, mostly because the structure of school and the structure of my family really helped decrease some of my ADHD and autistic traits, actually, which was, helpful in some ways, but also it means that there are people in my life now who are like, but you didn't show any of these signs as a kid. And I'm like, I had a lot more support as a kid. I'm an adult now. There's a lot of responsibilities. And I'm struggling to juggle them all.
Right, because executive function doesn't seem like such a problem when somebody else is making your meals every day and making sure that you get to bed on time every day and making sure that you go to school. So, for so many of us, these problems don't seem like executive function because somebody else is managing it for us.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. That was the case for me. Now, there are a lot of, especially autistic folks who fit the pathological demand avoidance profile, who, for them, all of those supports that were really helpful for me actually increased their traits and symptoms as a child. So everybody's a little different. But yeah, for me, My executive dysfunction didn't really show itself except for in forgetfulness, because people can't make me remember things, but they could help with all the other forms of executive dysfunction. So it just kind of flew under the radar for a long time.
So when you are working with someone who is dealing with executive dysfunction, how does laziness present?
So many people come to me and they're like, Megan, I feel like I'm lazy, but I'm a weird type of lazy because I'm working so hard and I'm still not getting it done. So, like, I must be lazy because that's the only explanation I've ever heard, right? But it just doesn't feel like laziness to me because surely laziness should be more enjoyable than this, you know? Um, to which I respond, yeah, that's because that's not laziness. Laziness, if it exists, which I'm going to argue it doesn't, but if it exists, it is when you are not doing a thing, you're making an active choice not to do the thing. So you feel in control of your decisions and you feel good about that decision to not do the thing. That would theoretically be laziness. And my sort of worldview about laziness is very much informed by Dr. Devin Price, who wrote the book Laziness Does Not Exist. So that's where I get a lot of my information about this. But he did a lot of studies on it and basically said, like, hey, choosing not to do something because it feels good not to do it is not some kind of sin. It's not laziness, it's not sloth, it's self-care, it's being human. You're just not a cog in the capitalist machine 24/7. Like, sometimes you're a person and that's okay.
Well, and when I think back to the times that I was called lazy as a child, there was always an implication that I wasn't doing something because I would prefer to be doing something else. And we know for us, that's often not the case. We just don't do the thing because we're overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And then there's guilt and shame about not doing the thing.
Yep. Yep. And I think a lot of people like to use guilt and shame as motivators. And I think that works really well in children if you have a very authoritarian parenting or teaching style, that can keep kids in line for a long time. But eventually they do leave and they start to realize the whole world isn't authoritarian and they do have choices. And a couple things happen. Number one, they start to resent you because they realize you made choices that hurt them and you did it on purpose. Number two, they start to realize that they maybe aren't as lazy as you said they were, and maybe struggling is something they actually deserved help with rather than ridicule, which leads to more resentment from number one. And number three, a lot of times they will start to rebel and do things specifically because you wouldn't want them to, even if it's bad for them, because it feels so good to make the opposite choice.
Oh, yeah, that pathological demand avoidance, y'all. It's a real kick in the pants.
Yes.
And functionally, when you and I talk about executive dysfunction, what are we talking about?
I love this question. Yes. Okay. So, the best definition for executive dysfunction that I've ever heard actually comes from Jessica over at How to ADHD on YouTube. And she describes it as it's like your brain has a CEO who's in charge of everything, but they have no secretary, no assistant, no help of any kind. And so they, like, you could have an itchy shirt tag and the death of a grandparent that happened 30 years ago and your to-do list all given the exact same priority because you have no one helping you prioritize or organize. So that is the best way to describe executive dysfunction. It is when you have dysfunction around making executive decisions. There are actually 8 forms of executive functioning. all of them can go wrong. And if I'm going to list them here in the second, but if you struggle with like 7 or 8 of them and you're like, oh my gosh, my brain must be like especially broken, I promise it's not. These are all very highly related functions. And so if you struggle with one, you're infinitely more likely to struggle with another. So it's okay if you struggle with most or all of these. So let's see, the 8 executive functions. Let's see if I can do them off the top of my head. So they're emotional regulation, impulse control, flexible thinking, working memory, task initiation, which is the one that a lot of people know about when it comes to executive dysfunction, is task initiation, planning and prioritization, organization, and self-monitoring. So those are the 8 executive functions, and executive dysfunctions when stuff goes wrong with those.
And because they are interrelated, when one is not working, all of the others suffer.
Yes, for sure. Well, just imagine, I mean, a lot of us don't have to imagine, it's our daily lives, but imagine that you struggle with working memory and you have a hard time holding information in your head while you do other stuff. That's going to make it really hard to plan and prioritize, for example, because it's hard to make a plan when you can't remember what you're supposed to be doing as you make the plan. And then planning and prioritizing, struggling to do that, especially if you have a history of being shamed for being lazy, is going to lead to emotional dysregulation because you feel like a bad, crappy person. And emotional regulation often leads to impulse control issues, whether that's excessive inhibition or excessive impulsivity, depending on the person. So, yeah, they're all connected.
And this all generally doom spirals down to self-reflection, which we are shockingly both really good at and really bad at generally, in the ways that we reflect on the wrong things. So there's so much guilt and shame about having done all of these other things incorrectly that we can't focus on what's gone right.
Absolutely. Yes. So that leads us to self monitoring, which is one of the executive functions. And a lot, not all, everyone's different, but a lot of autistic folks, especially, are very, very self aware. But we still often struggle with self monitoring, which is slightly different. So, like, self awareness to me is when you have an understanding of your patterns and, why you do things, versus self monitoring is like being able to observe yourself in space and time, which we are bad at most of the time.
That's why you run into very brightly colored walls. I do that. I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, brightly colored walls are apparently my nemesis because we can't see ourselves in space and time.
Mm-mm. It's one of the reasons that so many of us are very directionally challenged.
Mhm. And the way these things manifest often is how.
Well, it's a little difficult to separate the like shame and trauma aspect from the pure executive dysfunction because for so many of us they're linked, but I will try to kind of separate them. So pure executive dysfunction, theoretically, let's say you grew up without any shame or with very minimal shame, very supportive environment, but you still have executive dysfunction. What would that look like? That is going to look like for a lot of people, it's going to look like difficulty transitioning from one task to another, partially because autistic folks struggle with transitions, but also partially because if you have like ADHD, for example, you don't know what to do first or what to do last or the best order to do things in. That efficiency mindset is a big autism thing that I've noticed. I call it step thinking, where it's like, I have to figure out each step before I can start, which is really hard to do for most tasks. So trouble with transitions, taking a long time with transitions. It might look like you're not trying from the outside. So like a lot of parents will notice their kid, they're working on math homework, they're doing fine, they finish their math homework, and then they're on their phone or they're playing with a fidget toy or they're like, what are you doing? Your backpack's right there. Just get out your English homework. Like just move on. But their brain needs the time to transition. And it's actually, I think most people need transition time more than we respect. But so that's one way it can look. Another way pure executive dysfunction might look is this is the example I use a lot because it's a big one for me. Washing your clothes a million times because you wash it and then you leave it for 3 days and it's stinky, so you have to wash it again. Because you just forget. It's in there and you meant to switch it, but there was stuff in the dryer from 3 weeks ago and you didn't want to fold it, so you left it in the washer and it got stinky. So that's another good example, I think, of like adulthood executive dysfunction rather than childhood executive dysfunction. A big one for me is chopping. Chopping things when I'm preparing dinner is like a nightmare. I don't know why it's specific to chopping, but I hate it. I think it might be a sensory thing with the autism, actually.
You are not alone.
I do not want to touch all the little pieces. So, but yeah, those are some ways that pure executive dysfunction looks like. And then when we add in the shame flavor, it can look like a running monologue in your head of, you are so lazy, you are so stupid, why are you not doing this? Every other adult in the world does this every goddamn day, and here you are, 28 years old, and you still haven't figured this out. 50 years old, 70 years old, why are you still struggling? Like, this is the same shit we've done since we were like 6 years old. How have you not figured this out yet? And it's just very heavy and harsh and mean-spirited, and it's really meant to be helpful. You know, most things we do are meant to help us in some way. And shame is supposed to help us get things done because we don't want to feel that way anymore. And so we do the thing that needs doing. But what happens to ADHDers, especially over time, we've seen multiple studies done that show ADHDers get more negative feedback than non-ADHDers by a significant margin by like third grade. What happens is shame doesn't motivate us because it starts to wear us down. It's just exhausting. And eventually, you're just sick of fighting. And it's like, you know what? If you want to call me stupid, I guess I'm stupid. If you want to call me lazy, I guess I'm lazy. And we just give up. And you honestly can't blame people for giving up at that point when they've received that much negativity in their lives.
No, and we also know that the rate of ADHD in our incarcerated prison population is overwhelmingly high. So
Yes.
we're taking these kids and we're beating them up, and then we're telling them they can't do anything right. And the obvious choice then is to become a criminal because, of course, I can't do anything right. I may as well break the law. There's really something here too about modern productivity culture. So
Mhm.
let's talk about how that factors in to executive dysfunction.
Okay, absolutely. So modern productivity culture is very much based in hustle. It's very much based in work until you can't work anymore. Give yourself a bubble bath so that you look like you're doing the self care, and then get back to fucking work. Like, that's the idea. I really love, I do not know exactly how to say her name, but she is the nap priestess, Trisha Hersey, I think.
Percy, I think, yeah.
Hersey, okay. Oh, her work has been so healing. If you don't know her, go follow her at the Nap Ministry on Instagram and the website and everything. It's incredible and really truly radical, in at least for me it was when I first found it. But it's just this idea that we deserve rest, like first and foremost, not as an afterthought, not as a way to be more productive, but as a primary need. And like, whew, modern culture doesn't tell us that. So, yeah,
She's got a book out. It's called The Rest is Revolution, I think, is
I
the
think so.
name of the book. And it
Mhm.
is 100% worth reading.
Yeah, it's on my list. It's on the to be read list. Yeah. So modern culture,
The never ending to be read list.
never ending. But yeah, I would say modern culture basically treats human life as very disposable. That's what late stage capitalism does. I mean, that's what all capitalism does, but especially when you get to the late stage game of it, where we're at, um, human life truly becomes disposable. In the early stages, we like to pretend human life is valuable because that's the only way you could get people to agree to capitalism in the first place, is if it might make your life better. But now we've become so entrenched that capitalism is kind of like, yeah, screw you, screw your mother, and I don't care. And we're like, okay, because this is the only thing we know. And like, we can't fathom of a world without it. But I got off track. So anyway, capitalism devalues human life. And because of that, executive dysfunction, the way it plays into this culture is we are inherently seen as less than. We are inherently seen as less valuable. Not just like people who wouldn't usually identify as disabled are now, I think this is part of why we're having such an uptick in ADHD diagnoses, are now considering themselves disabled because late stage capitalism is turning it into more of a disability than it maybe used to be.
Right. And there are so many things here that are interlinked. We can't separate culturally what's going on from the fact that we are incapable of making forward progress when culturally there's no progress to be made.
Mhm. There's only so much self development and self improvement you can do before you hit a cultural wall.
And so much of laziness as a concept is about self-improvement, right? That's your problem. It's your problem to fix.
I think laziness, I think I mentioned this towards the beginning, but it serves as a foil to the ideal person and ideal productivity. And therefore, if laziness doesn't exist, it feels very, very threatening to people who have always defined themselves as a hard worker. Because it's like, well, if laziness doesn't exist, are you telling me I did all this hard work for nothing? And it's like, maybe there's more to it than being better than someone else. Maybe it's not about competition. Maybe working hard is something we're all doing and it just looks different depending on who you are.
What does it mean though if it's not a competition?
Well, exactly. It's hard. It's really hard. This was hard for me at first. It still is hard for me sometimes, I think. Like, I still get a little competitive when other ADHD creators will post about their struggles. And I'm like, well, I don't struggle with that. Like, am I not ADHD enough? Like, there's the comparison game, right? Um, if it's not a competition, then I think that means we are improving not just to better our own personal lives, but to better society, which means they're part of what we're working toward is not even for us. It is for future generations or for other people. And that's not something that's valued under capitalism. So it can feel a little worthless. So it's like all my hard work is not worthwhile because you said laziness doesn't exist.
So, if laziness is a construct, then what does it mean to still struggle with executive dysfunction?
Mm, I mean, laziness is a construct. I mean, executive dysfunction is like a construct as well, but it's based in like real struggles and
Right.
brain chemistry differences, whereas laziness is much more based in a cultural construct. So it's a little different. I think if laziness isn't real, then executive dysfunction becomes a lot more like needing glasses.
And I think that's what's key is that we don't want to think of executive dysfunction as worthy of
No.
requiring this sort of
Mm-mm.
help.
Mm-mm. I don't, and granted, this does come from a place of privilege. There are plenty of people who need glasses who can't get to them. But in Western society, most of us have access to eye care if we need it desperately. And I never had a question about like, oh, am I worthy enough to get glasses? Like, is it bad enough? Do I really need them? Like, there was none of that. It's just accepted. And I think it's because eyesight, I think we instituted like close to universal eye care before really hardcore late stage capitalism kicked in. And so it's sort of like public libraries would never be approved today, but we instituted them before we got to this point we're at. And so I think we just accept that, okay, it makes my life better. It makes me a more productive worker. So it lends itself to capitalism as well. And that's the crazy part, right? Is that if we just accepted that executive dysfunction was disabling and we provided people the supports they needed, they would have less executive dysfunction and they would be able to contribute more to the capitalist machine, which is not
That
always
is
the goal.
correct.
But it's the people who are so hung up on laziness is real and executive dysfunction is an excuse and you sound ridiculous. Like these are the people I've been arguing with on the internet for a couple of weeks now. I don't understand where they're coming from, because it's like, if the goal is you want people to be more productive, and I think this is the thing, that's not the goal. If you want people to be more productive, you would just accept that this is real because there's a lot of scientific evidence showing that it is. And you would provide people with support. They would be more productive. You would get what you want. But that's not what we want. We want to devalue lives that are different from our own. That's what we want. And that's us.
Okay. I want to go in a slightly different direction.
Sure.
When we talk about eyeglasses as a requirement, there's not really a culture around needing them or not needing them. Whereas if we look at deaf culture and cochlear implants, right, there is a huge conflict within that culture around whether that's a necessity, whether that's damaging, whether that takes something away from being a part of the culture. In what ways have you seen that kind of entrenched mentality within neurodivergent culture at large? Because I think that it exists in similar ways, and I'm trying to see if perhaps there are parallels worth recognizing now so that we don't lose the plot, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I think this happens a lot with all kinds of neurodivergence and like mental health issues and stuff like that, where getting better feels like a threat to your identity.
Yes.
Right. And I dealt with this for a very long time. I was like, if I feel, especially because, I deal with a lot of emotional dysregulation, but for a long time I didn't have that word and I didn't know I was autistic and ADHD. I thought I was depressed, but I was like, my depression is weird as fuck because like I don't have these 2-week episodes. I have like hours and then I'm fine. And I'm realizing those hours were likely meltdowns, not depressive episodes. So it felt like every time I started to feel better, it was like, well, then your depression can't be real because you're literally, who does that? Who swings that hard and that far? Like that's just not, it's not a mental illness. You're just broken. Right? That was very much the
Mhm.
narrative I was party to for a long time. And I think getting better represents a threat. Or getting better may not be the right language. It depends on the person and the neurodivergence, but improving or treating or coping, accommodating your neurodivergence can feel like a threat because it's like, well, wait, if I accommodate this, it starts to go away. And if it starts to go away, I feel less autistic. And if I feel less autistic, I probably am less autistic. There's already all these strangers on the internet telling me I'm not really autistic because I'm a woman, I guess. And I, okay, I don't want to just blame it on being a woman. I also don't have an intellectual disability. And for a lot of people, that means you're not autistic, even though the two are, in fact, separate, can go together, but sometimes they don't. They're not one and the same.
No, because there's just not, probably not just as many, but giftedness and autism is related in the
Totally
same ways
possible too.
that mental disability and autism are related. So we tend to go one way or the other. There's not a whole lot of middle of the road autists.
No, we're never in the middle. We're always black and white.
That's correct.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's where we can start to lose the plot a little bit, when we start to make our autism about proving that we're autistic. We're centering others instead of centering our own experience. You need to let other people die mad about it.
Yes. And this comes into play too, I think, internally in the community when we talk about things like Asperger's, when we talk about levels, that there are going to be people who have different needs from you, and advocating for their needs doesn't take away from your needs.
Yes. 100%. Yes. I actually did a informal poll on my TikTok the other day, asking higher support needs autistic folks and or their advocates, if they don't have their own TikTok or can't communicate in that way, if how they felt about the language around support needs, because I'd been having some interesting conversations with people who would be considered lower support needs, saying like, this is just functioning labels all over again and I don't find it helpful. And I was like, okay, that's how a lot of lower support needs people feel, but how do other people feel? And a lot of like medium support needs people responded, and they were like, I like it because functioning labels are about how I function for others. Support needs are about what I need, and that's different and that matters. And then I had some advocates respond saying like, hey, I tried to talk to my brother about it. He didn't totally grasp the conversation, but he kind of understood. And he just felt as long as it's helpful in getting him what he needs, he's for it. And that is where I think lower support needs people miss the point, because we are able to get our needs met even without all this language. But there are people who have higher support needs who need that language to get what they need. And I think it's short-sighted for lower support needs people to pretend that their experience is the only one. It's always dangerous.
And I think culturally that presents a problem too, where we begin to think that autism is not as serious a problem as it potentially can be. When we are talking about people with lower support needs who won't ever speak or will always require care, these folks are still included in the umbrella of autism. So, when we're talking about lower support needs and the people who feel like that's an identity, how can we help become more clear about the overall needs of the community?
Okay, this is something I've had to do a lot of personal work on, because I would consider myself pretty lower support needs. Granted, a lot of that's just because the support needs I do have are easy to accommodate. Like, society is much more accepting of them than they are of like alternative and augmentative communication devices and stuff like that. So my needs are seen as socially appropriate, or at least slightly more so. But anyway, as someone who is sort of on that end of the spectrum, who very much sees my autism as an identity, and sometimes gets a little cagey and defensive about it when people threaten my version of autism by existing with a different version, I think it requires a couple of things. First, you need to go out of your way to learn from medium and higher support needs autistics. This is not always going to be easy because, as some of these advocates pointed out in my question, they were like, hey, my sister doesn't have TikTok because it's not really within her scope of capabilities. So they're not just going to be on TikTok. You have to go out of your way to find these voices and to listen to them. And that is not always the most convenient thing in the world, but convenience can't always be the most important factor. If you want to change how you think about something, you're going to have to do some of the work, some of the legwork. So that is something I am sort of working on. I've found a couple of like AAC users who are on TikTok, and I do my best to like follow them and really pay attention to their videos. When advocates do comment on my posts, I really do my best to pay attention, respond, think critically, listen to them, stuff like that. And I do my best to welcome advocates into my community on TikTok, because there are a lot of autistic folks who are like, if you're not autistic, you stay the fuck out of here. And I understand that mentality. I do. But that excludes a lot of autistic folks because they cannot communicate without their advocate. And I think we have to make at least some room for advocates, especially advocates who are doing their best. But yeah, so shut up and listen. Go out of your way to listen. And also just doing some personal reflection work on like, why is it so important to me that my version of autism is the only one? What does that mean to me? And a lot of times what you're going to find is a deep core wound of feeling dismissed and invalidated growing up. And you're kind of swinging the other direction where it's like, okay, now my version of autism is the only one, and that'll make me feel valid. And it won't. That'll disintegrate eventually. So it's really better to just support the whole community where you can.
And I think that there are, especially for late diagnosed autists, there are some degrees of learning that we go through, right? Because I know for me, my entire identity shifted when I got my diagnosis. And I looked back at early childhood and went, oh, well, so that's what was wrong with me all of this time. It wasn't that I was lazy or couldn't handle tags in my clothes. Like, these things that should have been assisted for me were not in any way. And there is a grief process there for us, I think.
Oh yeah, and I really try to ride the line between validating late diagnosed folks like us, but also reminding late diagnosed folks that early diagnosis does not mean early acceptance. And a lot of people
No.
yeah, a lot of people who were diagnosed early went through a whole different kind of trauma that we need to respect. And so trying to ride that line.
Yeah, especially if they did ABA. And I feel
Mhm.
like that's a place where we don't, our generation, if they were diagnosed early, almost certainly went through ABA therapies,
Mhm.
even 10, 15 years younger. And we don't talk about the benefit of ABA either, but that's really important in particularly Black and marginalized communities, because if you have a Black child, telling them to not behave as normal people do can functionally get them killed. Like, we're not having the conversations here about the nuance that we all live with.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. The conversation around ABA is really, really fraught. There's a lot of pain involved there for the parents who feel it's their only option, but they recognize the harm that's being done, but they don't know what else to do. There's a lot of pain for survivors who just no matter what, they can't wrap their head around doing that to any child for any reason. And I have to respect and understand that. And there's a lot of nuance that goes into ABA. And personally, I don't feel super qualified to speak on it. But I'm doing my best to listen a little more, because I had very black and white feelings about it for a while there. I'm trying to listen.
And I think that's what's important here. When we talk about so many of the issues that affect our community, it's that there are degrees, right? That we all got a different experience. And so our version of what it should look like isn't going to be universal.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
And that comes back to this experience of lazy and how we internalize that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. 100%. I think depends on the culture we were a part of, depends on the like family system we grew up in, it depends on the school we went to. um there's lots of different factors for sure.
So if laziness doesn't exist, what's the cure?
So if laziness doesn't exist, then that is the cure. The cure to feeling like shit about your inability to get stuff done is recognizing laziness isn't a thing, and your struggles make sense. This is something that has changed my life, is like, your negative or unhealthy coping mechanisms, they make sense. Your struggles make sense. All of this is for a reason, and not like in a metaphysical way, but in like a brain chemistry way. Like, your brain is trying to help you with these things, believe it or not. It might be very misguided, but it's trying to help. And so I think if laziness doesn't exist, then what we really have to do, our true work, is not to cure executive dysfunction, because I don't think that's possible, personally speaking. If it is for you, amazing, go for it. Do all the things. If it works, it works. For me, executive dysfunction is probably always going to be part of my life, but I have found some ways to kind of mitigate it. So number one is medication. That it works really well for me. When I'm not pregnant, I use a stimulant. I find that more effective. But since I am pregnant, we're going with non-stimulant. Far less effective, but it's something. And by the way, when I say far less effective, that is just for me. Everyone is different. I know lots of people on non-stimulants who find them miracle workers. So just so you know. Uh, so that's probably number one for me. Number two is body doubling. I use body doubling all the time. Helps me get stuff done. Even sometimes I body double with my 3-year-old. I'm like, hey, kiddo, you want to come sit with me while I do this? He's like, yeah, of course. Like, he's all about it. But I do a lot of virtual body doubling, all that. So yeah, body doubling's a big one. What is the third thing? Oh, the third thing is habit stacking. That's how I've organized my whole morning, is organized around my cup of morning coffee. Like, if I forget to have my coffee, or if we're out of coffee, I'm not taking my meds. I'm not filming my TikToks. I'm not showering. I'm not doing anything, because all of those habits are stacked on top of the coffee. So yeah, but it works really well for me, habit stacking. And then the last thing is like just acceptance of the fact that there's going to be days where the executive dysfunction wins. And instead of making that mean you're a lazy piece of shit, I make that mean, oh, the ADHD is really bad today. That kind of sucks. And like, do you see how that's so much more neutral?
And it makes a difference internally when I acknowledge that, oh, it's not me, it's just the way my brain is today. Then I don't feel bad about taking care of myself, because I would take care of myself in the same way if I was sick with a cold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's no difference in terms of care once we recognize that this is just the way we are.
Mm-hmm. I'm so sorry. I have to get the door. I'm so sorry. The drywall guys are here. Is that
Are
okay?
here. That's fine. Go. I'll talk for a minute.
Okay, I'll be right back.
So I'm going to talk for a minute. And one of the things that I feel like really matters here is that we are clear about how we internalize those methods of care. So Megan's got a program that she's going to talk about here in just a minute. And I have a workshop on Friday. Yearly and founding members of the Neurodiversity Media Network get to come to this for free. We're going to build your personal 504 plan. So, we're going to take a look at all of these degrees of functioning. And in this summer workshop series, we're going to look at sleep, we're going to look at diet, we're going to look at planning, and then we're going to look at your digital landscape. And then we're going to take those things and boil them out into a document that you can use with coworkers, employers, partners that allow you to define what it is that your needs are and how you need to take care of them. So Megan has your executive function program. Tell me what it's called.
It's called the Neurodivergent Magic Program.
That's what I thought it was. And then I was going to be like, no, that's wrong. And I don't want to get it wrong. So, okay. Tell us what we're learning.
Okay, so basically, I created something called the Functional Freedom Framework. It is about finding increased functionality and increased freedom through three main things: emotional tools, practical tools, and community. Because I think community makes both of these way more effective. And I think there's a lot of coaches out there who are like, you just have to love yourself and everything will be better. And like, no. To me, that's not enough. For me, that's not. It's very helpful, but it's not enough on its own. And then on the other hand, there's a lot of coaches who are like, just buy my planner and everything will be fixed, like the practical side. And I'm like, also, no, you need both. You need them together. So that's really what my program does. It's a course coaching hybrid. So there's a whole video course that you can go through at your own pace with, journaling prompts and all this stuff to go with it. And then every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern, we meet on Zoom. Everybody who's in the program is welcome. I want to say there's like almost 30 people in the program, but usually there's only like 4 or 5 people on the Monday night calls, so you don't have to worry about struggling to get your voice heard. And it's just a great way to like get some assistance from someone who lives with executive dysfunction, and not because I think I love therapy. I'm not knocking it. I've been in therapy a long time. I think it's great. But in my experience, many therapists treat executive dysfunction as a secondary issue. And they're like, oh, if we just treat the depression, the executive dysfunction will go away, which for many people is true. But if you have ADHD, executive dysfunction is a primary issue, and you cannot just treat other stuff and it'll just go away. You have to treat it. And so that's what I help people do.
Yes, I am looking at a course, I think probably next year, that's going with a therapist who does specifically work with executive dysfunction. And she's going to talk about strategies and actual tools that you can use therapeutically to figure out these things. But the reality is that neurodivergence is neither well studied nor understood. And so when it comes to the modalities that are required to help us do this work, it's not always therapeutic, at least not yet. We're still not there yet. And so programs like this allow you to be with your peers, which matters, and do the work in a group. So we will drop links in show notes and we will make sure that that is available to you. But if this is a place that you struggle, if executive dysfunction is the hurdle that if you keep calling yourself lazy in your head and can't seem to get anything done, then this is the problem, and we would like you to solve it in as much as it is solvable.
Yeah. Yes.
Right?
Mm.
Megan, thank you so much for your time today. Where can people find you?
Okay, so I am most active over on TikTok at Megmoxie, Megmoxie. But I'm also pretty active on Instagram. So that's at neurodivergent_magic. So yeah, that's where you can find me.
Final thoughts, anything that you would like to wrap up for us here, or bullet point in case people have missed it?
I think the main thing I just want to say is if the phrase laziness does not exist makes you feel some kind of way and it makes you feel kind of angry or hurt or something like that, I really, really encourage you to look at how the word lazy was treated when you were a child and go back to that and start asking yourself if that paradigm that you were taught as a child still holds up under your adult eye. And if it does, it does. Personally, I'm going to disagree with you, but that at least you've looked. Please do that before commenting on my videos. Please do some introspection first. Not everybody has. But yeah, if laziness does not exist, if that concept freaks you out, first of all, you're not alone. It freaked me out at first too. It's okay. But yeah, do a little reflection on where you learned those stories from and ask yourself if those stories are serving you anymore or if you want a new story.
And y'all, that's what we do around here. We write new stories. It's important for you to be able to take what you've been given and go and do something different with it, regardless of where or from whom that came from, even if it came from you. So go get a different story. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for being here. We will be back in 2 weeks, and we will see you